Here's something I think about a lot when I study ancient history. Power, real power, absolute power, has almost never been evenly distributed. And the closer you get to the center of it, the more dangerous it becomes. Not just for your enemies, for everyone around you, including the people who were supposed to be protected by it. In ancient China, the women of the imperial court sat as close to the center of power as any human being could get. An empress had titles, ceremonies, armies of attendants. Her words could reshape the fates of ministers and governors. On paper, she was second only to the Son of Heaven himself. But here's the thing about power that depends entirely on one person's favor. The moment that favor disappears, so does everything else. And in the imperial courts of ancient China, what happened to a woman when that favor was gone could be, depending on the dynasty and the emperor and who took power after him, one of the most terrifying things I've ever encountered in historical research. Let me take you to around 195 BCE, the Han Dynasty. China is freshly unified, still raw, still figuring out what a centralized empire actually looks like. And the man who built it, Emperor Gaozu, is dying. He has a wife. Her name is Lü Ji, and history will remember her as Empress Lü. She has given this man everything: sons, decades of loyalty. She was captured by enemy forces at one point and held for years, and she endured it. She held the family together through wars and political instability when there was no guarantee her husband would even survive. She is not a passive figure. She never was. But Emperor Gaozu also has a favorite concubine. Her name is Lady Qi, and he loves her in a way that makes everyone at court uneasy, because love inside an imperial palace is never just personal. It's always political. It always has consequences. The emperor wants Lady Qi's son to be his heir. He wants to set aside Empress Lü's son, the legitimate crown prince, and rewrite the succession in Lady Qi's favor. He spends years trying to make this happen. He doesn't succeed. He dies before he can make it official. And Empress Lü becomes the Empress Dowager, the most powerful woman in China, the regent behind the young emperor. And Lady Qi has no more protection. What happened next was recorded by Sima Chen, who is probably the greatest historian ancient China ever produced. He wrote it down in the Shiji, the Records of the Grand Historian, which is a foundational text of Chinese historiography. It's not legend, it's not rumor, it's the official historical record. Empress Lü ordered Lady Qi's hands and feet cut off. She ordered her eyes gouged out. Her ears were destroyed. A substance was used to permanently damage her voice. And then Lady Qi was placed in a latrine. Not a cell, not an exile, a latrine. Empress Lü called her Renzi, the human swine, and she brought her own son, the emperor, to see what she had done. The emperor saw it, and according to the Shiji, he was never the same. He reportedly said that whoever was capable of this was not someone he could call his mother. He fell into a depression. He reportedly stopped governing effectively. He died young, not long after. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because this is the part that I find almost more unsettling than the cruelty itself. Empress Lü wasn't considered simply a monster by her contemporaries. She was feared, yes. She was ruthless beyond almost anyone in the dynasty's early history. But she was also respected as a capable ruler. The Han dynasty didn't collapse under her regency. Trade functioned, administration functioned. The terror she inflicted on Lady Qi existed alongside competent governance. The cruelty wasn't separate from the system, it was part of it. Because in the logic of imperial power, a defeated woman, especially one who had come dangerously close to displacing the legitimate heir, couldn't just be removed. She had to be unmade completely, so that no one looking at what remained of her could possibly imagine her as a rival. It wasn't random violence. It was a demonstration, a message sent to every woman at court who might ever think about reaching for more than they were given. Lady Qi's fate was one version of what could happen, but the imperial courts of China were vast and long-lived, spanning centuries and dynasties. And the ways the system could destroy a defeated woman were, in some cases, even more calculated than this, more institutionalized, more patient. And that's where things get even stranger. There's a term in the history of the Chinese imperial court that most people outside of academic history have never heard. Lěng Gōng, the cold palace. It doesn't refer to a specific building, it refers to a practice, a category of place. Any of the secondary, neglected compounds within the vast imperial complex where fallen women were relocated when they lost the emperor's favor. Not executed, not formally exiled, just moved, inward, into a smaller world. The gates were locked, the servants assigned there were minimal and of the lowest rank. No ceremonies, no visitors, no news from the outside world. You were given enough to survive, and nothing more. And then the days started passing. Some women lived in the cold palace for decades. Think about what that actually means. You were at the center of the most powerful court in the known world. Your birthday was an occasion of state. Ministers bowed when you entered a room. Your preferences shaped the lives of thousands of people you'd never met. And then, one day, that's gone. And the days after that are silent and identical. The same small courtyard, the same walls, the same fading awareness of what it used to feel like to matter. Historians who've studied the psychological dimension of the inner court describe it as a kind of social death. The body kept living, sometimes for a long time, but the person, in every meaningful sense, was already erased, already gone. She just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The cold palace was, in some ways, the merciful version of what could happen. Because there were women who didn't get the cold palace. There were women who lost their position at exactly the wrong moment to exactly the wrong person. And one of the most striking examples in all of Chinese history involves one of its most complicated figures, Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian is the only woman in more than 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history to have officially ruled as emperor in her own right. That alone tells you something about her. She is someone who looked at a system specifically designed to prevent women from holding ultimate power, and she navigated it anyway, over decades, through intelligence and patience and political maneuvering that historians are still analyzing. Depending on who's telling the story, she's a visionary administrator or a ruthless manipulator. Probably she was both. Most people who reach that level of power are. But what she did to Empress Wang and consort Shao in the 7th century CE is documented in the Tang Shu, the official history of the Tang dynasty, and it's one of those passages that stays with you. Here's the background. Wu Zetian started as a concubine in the court of Emperor Taizong. When he died, as was custom, she was sent to a Buddhist convent to live out her days as a shaved-head nun. That was the standard fate for concubines of a deceased emperor who had no children. She wasn't supposed to re-enter the imperial world. She did anyway. Emperor Gaozong, Taizong, encouraged this because she thought Wu could be used as a weapon against consort Shao, her primary rival for the emperor's attention. The empress thought she was the one doing the maneuvering. She wasn't. Over the following years, Wu Zetian consolidated the emperor's trust so completely and made herself so indispensable to court governance that both Empress Wang and consort Xiao became liabilities. Their fates were sealed. According to the Tang historical records, both women were stripped of their ranks, beaten severely, and then, and this is the part that the historians recorded carefully, their hands and feet were cut off, and they were placed in wine vats. Before consort Xiao died, she reportedly cursed Wu Zetian by name. She said that in her next life, she would be reborn as a cat, and Wu Zetian as a rat, and she would chase her across every life to come. Whether you believe in that kind of thing or not, the image of it, a woman dying in that condition, still finding the strength to curse her enemy, has persisted in Chinese cultural memory for more than 1,000 years. Wu Zetian reportedly banned cats from the palace afterward. Now, I should say, historians approach these accounts carefully because the writers of the Tang Shu had political motivations to portray Wu Zetian as monstrous. Some details may be embellished. The broad strokes, though, are generally accepted as historically grounded because they fit the documented pattern of how power operated in the inner court. And that's the thing I keep coming back to. Not just the individual acts of cruelty, horrifying as they are, but the structural reality underneath them. The fact that when a woman lost her position in the imperial court, there was no floor beneath the fall, no law that said this far and no further. The only thing that had ever protected her was the emperor's favor, and when that was gone, everything was gone with it. The cold palace, the wine vat, the latrine, these weren't aberrations. They were possibilities that existed within the logic of the system, available to anyone who had enough power and enough reason to use them. But there's one more layer to this that I haven't gotten to yet, something that goes beyond what happened to women who survived the loss of power, because there were also women who were caught not by a rival, but simply by time, by an emperor's natural death. And what the imperial system prescribed for them is, in some ways, the hardest part of this whole story to sit with. In 1424, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty died. He was one of the most consequential rulers in Chinese history. He built the Forbidden City, he sent the massive treasure fleets of Zheng He across the Indian Ocean, he moved the capital to Beijing. He was enormous in historical terms, a figure who reshaped China's relationship with the world. When he died, the court followed an ancient custom that had never been fully abolished, despite centuries of Confucian scholars arguing against it. 16 concubines were chosen to accompany him in death. The practice was called zàng, burial accompaniment, and it was exactly what it sounds like. When an emperor died, a selection of his concubines, sometimes a few, sometimes many more, were killed so that they could be buried alongside him, servants in death as they had been in life. The practice stretched back to the earliest dynasties, fading and then returning, never quite disappearing even when official policy condemned it. The Ming Dynasty records about zàng are some of the most detailed we have from any period, and within those records there is a document that historians return to again and again. It doesn't come from a Chinese source, it comes from Korea. One of the concubines chosen for burial accompaniment was Korean. She had been sent to the Chinese court as part of the diplomatic exchanges between the two nations, a practice that was itself a form of coercion dressed as honor. Because a Korean document survived describing what happened in the hours before the ceremony, we have something that official Chinese histories almost never provide: a voice. The document records that the concubines were brought into a hall, food was set before them, a final meal, and then, when the time came, they were positioned beneath hooks set into the ceiling with ropes around their necks. The document records that many of them wept, that some resisted and had to be forced, that others stood quietly, that the Emperor Shunde, the deceased son who had inherited the throne, reportedly wept as he watched. One of the Korean concubines, in her final moments, called out to her Korean attendant by name. The attendant's name was recorded in the document. The words spoken were recorded. They've survived for more than 600 years. I'm not going to repeat them here. There's something about a person's last words that feels like it deserves not to be turned into narration. But they exist. They're in the historical record. And the fact that they are, the fact that someone, a translator or a court official or a grieving attendant, thought to write them down, and that a document survived, matters in a way that's hard to fully articulate. Because this is what history does sometimes, in its better moments. It preserves the things that power tried to bury. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes in the margin of an official record, or in a foreign document, or in a single line that a court historian included, almost as an afterthought, you find a person, a real one, not a lesson, not a cautionary tale, not a symbol of a dynasty's excess. Just a person who was afraid and who called out to someone she knew. Zàng was officially abolished in China in the late 17th century during the Qing dynasty. Officially. Historical evidence suggests the practice continued in modified forms for some time after that. And the archaeological record at Ming tombs has, over the decades, produced skeletal remains in locations and positions consistent with the historical accounts. Real evidence in bone and soil of real people. So here's where I want to end, because I think this question is worth sitting with. Why does this matter? Why spend time learning about cruelties from a world that no longer exists, in a system that was formally abolished centuries ago? And I think the answer is this. Understanding how power really works, not in theory, not in the idealized version of itself that power always prefers to project, requires understanding who bore the cost of it. In ancient China, as in most of the ancient world, that cost fell most heavily on the people with the least ability to refuse. And among the people closest to the absolute center of imperial power, that meant the women of the inner court. They had proximity to the emperor. They had titles and ceremonies that marked them as significant. But they had no legal standing of their own, no mechanism to appeal, to refuse, to escape. Their survival depended entirely on the goodwill of one person, whose goodwill was simultaneously the greatest possible protection and the most volatile, unpredictable variable in their world. And when it was withdrawn, whether through politics, jealousy, a rival's cunning, or simply the natural death of an aging man, the fall was total. There was no partial loss. There was no negotiated exit. There was Lady Qi in a latrine, unable to speak. There was Empress Wang in a vine vat. There was a Korean woman calling a name in a hall in the Forbidden City. These stories don't make ancient China uniquely brutal. Every civilization has its buried ugliness, its systems of violence that ran just beneath the polished surface of official history. What makes these particular stories worth telling is that they survived, that enough of the truth leaked through foreign documents and honest historians and archaeological evidence for us to see it now. And seeing it, really seeing it, not as a collection of dramatic historical facts, but as the actual lived reality of actual human beings, changes something. It should change something. Because the real question here isn't just what happened to defeated empresses in ancient China. The real question is, who got to define what power meant? Who got to decide who mattered and under what conditions? And who paid the price when the answer changed? That question echoes through 2,000 years of history. And if you listen carefully enough, it doesn't sound entirely distant.